When we first drove into the neighborhood, everything about it felt like perfection, the kind of place you only see in glossy magazines or those commercials where families laugh in their backyards, while sprinklers water perfectly trimmed lawns. And I remember thinking that maybe, just maybe, this was the fresh start we had been searching for, the place where our children could grow up safe, where my wife could finally relax, and where I could leave behind the chaos of city life. But even as I admired the clean streets and the way every single house looked almost identical, with its freshly painted shutters and spotless driveways, there was a small unease in the back of my mind, something I brushed off as moving day nerves. Because who wouldn't feel nervous moving into a new home with new neighbors and an HOA that promised, in bold letters on every brochure, safety and order above all else? And as we unpacked that first evening, surrounded by unopened boxes and half-eaten takeout, there was this strange quietness outside, the kind of silence that feels too heavy, as if the air itself is waiting for something. Yet I told myself it was just because we weren't used to how peaceful it was. And I went to bed smiling, believing we had finally made the right choice. But then just as the clock neared midnight, there was a faint sound at the front door. Not a knock, not footsteps, but the soft scratch of paper being slipped beneath the welcome mat. And when I opened the door, confused and half expecting to find a late delivery, there was nothing there except a plain envelope, unmarked except for my name written in thick, blocky letters, and as I bent down to pick it up, I felt this rush of cold air even though the night was warm and I carried it inside, joking nervously to my wife that maybe the HOA was just welcoming us with a cheesy neighborhood letter. But when I tore it open, my smile froze, because inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "First Warning," stamped in bold red letters across the top, followed by a list of rules that made my stomach twist. Rules like curtains must be closed after sundown, outdoor lights must remain off past 11 p.m., and no unnecessary noise after dark. And at the bottom, in smaller print, the words "Non-compliance will not be tolerated," with no signature. No explanation, nothing. And my wife laughed uneasily, saying maybe it was a prank. Maybe one of the neighbors was just being dramatic. But the longer I stared at that paper, the less funny it seemed. Because we had only been here for a few hours, hadn't even met a single person yet, and already we were receiving warnings. Warnings about rules we never agreed to, rules that weren't in any contract we signed. And as the night stretched on, I found myself unable to sleep, lying awake and listening to the strange, unnatural silence outside, broken only once by the creak of what sounded like a gate opening and closing on its own. And though I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, I couldn't shake the image of that envelope, the way the ink looked almost too fresh, as if it had been written just moments before I opened the door. And when I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, I dreamed of shadows standing at the edge of our lawn, watching, waiting, whispering rules I didn't understand. And by the time morning came, with sunlight flooding through the blinds we had forgotten to close, the letter lay on the kitchen counter like a stain on our perfect new beginning. And deep down, though I didn't want to admit it, I knew this wasn't just a mistake or a prank. This was only the beginning of something far darker. Something that would test every ounce of courage I thought I had, because the last warning letter was still waiting for us, and the neighborhood was already watching. The next morning should have felt like the real beginning, the sun shining, birds chirping faintly somewhere in the distance, and the kids running through the half-unpacked living room like explorers in a new world. But the presence of that letter on the counter turned everything sour, like a black cloud hanging over a clear sky, and even though I tried to hide it, my wife noticed the way I kept glancing at it. The way I folded it and slid it into a drawer as if tucking it away would erase the unease it planted inside me. But it didn't, not really because I couldn't stop thinking about how specific those rules were. Not generic HOA rules about lawns or parking, but rules about curtains, lights, silence, things that didn't make sense in a normal neighborhood. And I kept replaying in my head how the envelope had arrived, how quietly it had been slipped under our mat. And I realized someone must have been right at our door while we were awake, moving boxes just feet away from us, watching, listening, close enough to touch. And that thought sent a chill crawling up my spine, though I forced myself to smile and wave when one of the neighbors across the street stepped outside. An older man with gray hair, neatly dressed as though he was going to church, who stared at me for a long moment before giving the smallest of nods. Not a friendly wave, not a cheerful welcome, just a stiff acknowledgement. and then he disappeared back into his house without a word, leaving me with a heavy feeling that we weren't exactly welcomed here the way we thought we'd be. And later, as we unpacked, my daughter tugged on my sleeve and whispered that she saw a lady standing on the sidewalk last night, staring at her bedroom window, but when she blinked, the lady was gone. And though I told her it was probably just her imagination, something about the way she said it, serious and certain, made me wonder if maybe she had seen whoever left that letter, and I caught myself checking the windows too often, pulling the curtains aside to look out, only to find the street unnervingly empty. The same row of identical houses lined like soldiers, their blinds all perfectly closed, no laughter, no movement, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. And by noon I decided to take a walk, to get some air, to maybe meet a neighbor or two, to break this strange sense of isolation. But the more I walked, the stranger it felt, because every house looked lived in, yet I saw no one, heard nothing but the faint hum of distant air conditioners, and when I finally spotted a woman gardening, I waved and walked over, relieved, ready to introduce myself. But the moment she saw me, she froze, her smile vanishing as though she realized she had made a mistake by being outside. And when I asked about the HOA, about the letter we had received, her hands trembled slightly, and she whispered something so low I almost didn't catch it. Something like, "Don't ignore them," before she quickly gathered her tools and hurried inside, leaving me alone on the sidewalk with 1,000 questions. And when I turned to head back home, I noticed for the first time the small black cameras fixed to the corners of every house, tiny but precise, all angled not at the street but toward the neighbors' houses, including mine, as though everyone was watching everyone else. And a dread spread through me that maybe that's how they knew we hadn't shut our curtains. That's how they knew the lights were still on past 11, and maybe that's how they always knew. And by the time I reached our house, my wife was at the door looking pale, holding another envelope in her hands. This one plain white with no name written on it, and when I opened it, all it said was, "We are patient, but not forever." And I felt my chest tighten because we hadn't even been here 24 hours and already we were being warned again. And when night fell, I made sure every curtain was drawn, every light turned off before 11, every sound muted. But the silence that followed was worse, heavier, pressing down on us as we sat in the living room whispering to each other, pretending to be calm for the kids, until I heard it again, that faint sound outside, paper sliding against wood. And though I tried to convince myself not to check, not to look, my curiosity and fear were too strong. So I opened the door, heart pounding, and there it was. Another envelope, black this time, sitting like a shadow on the mat. And when I picked it up, I realized the paper inside wasn't typed or printed but handwritten, scrawled in jagged letters that looked rushed, panicked, almost desperate. And it didn't say warning this time, it said, "Leave while you can." And my blood ran cold because whoever wrote this wasn't the HOA. This wasn't official. This was someone trying to tell us the truth. And yet when I looked up and down the street, every window was dark, every house silent, and I couldn't tell if the neighborhood was trying to keep us in or trying to keep something else out. All right, I'll write chapter 2 in the same YouTube narration style, suspenseful, easy to listen to, and as one long flowing paragraph. I couldn't fit a full 5,000 words in a single reply because of length limits, but here's a very large, polished, standalone chunk that continues the story strongly and can be used as part of your narration. If you want more after reading this, I'll continue immediately in the same style. The notices started like rain at first, small, polite, almost bureaucratic. Then they stacked up like a curse. A plain white envelope tucked under the welcome mat, a glossy card slipped through the mail slot, a sticker plastered on the inside of our front door beneath the handle that I noticed only because the kids were fighting over a toy, and I bumped into it. And they all said the same things in different tones, sometimes clinical, sometimes cruelly casual, sometimes almost pleading. Curtains must be drawn after sundown, lights off by 11, no visitors after sunset, no loud music, no gatherings, keep lawn neat, remove toys by dusk, maintain silence. The rules sounded like the kind of petty edicts a real estate brochure might bury in the fine print. But there was a difference. These notices always arrived at night, always left with a little extra, an inked line of emphasis, a hand-drawn circle, the same stamp pressed into the corner as if the hand that handled them wanted to make sure you felt the weight of the word. And the stamp was simple and cruel, warning, compliance mandatory, it declared. And underneath, in smaller, colder type, non-compliance will be addressed. and the word addressed had an edge to it that made my stomach tighten in a way that no HOA fee ever had. We obeyed at first like people learning the rules of a strange game. Pull the curtains closed. Wait until the clock hands met at 11 to blow out the lamps. Nod to the empty windows across the street as though there might be eyes behind them. But obedience didn't bring relief. It brought more rules, like a machine that needed oiling with our fear. And the more we tried to play by that machine's calendar, the more we realized the rules weren't just about order. They were about control. The kids adapted unnervingly fast. My daughter learned to tiptoe to the bathroom at night and counted our breaths with a seriousness far beyond her years. And my son, proud and sullen, swore he'd sleep with his flashlight on and then switched it off without telling us, because he wanted to prove he wasn't afraid. And that defiance, so quietly childish, felt to me like a tiny rebellion against a system we hadn't agreed to, but were slowly being folded into. One evening, tired and furious at the way our new life had been narrowed into timetables and warnings, I left a porch light on a little past 11, just a few minutes longer, because we were eating dinner and my wife's hands were messy, and I didn't want to stumble around in the dark. Nothing dramatic. Just the small human thing of wanting to be comfortable in your own home, but that small act felt like a flare in the sterile night. I woke before dawn to the soft rustle of paper and the smell of something metallic I couldn't identify at first. And when I opened my eyes, there was a letter on the hallway runner, not on the mat where the others had been, but right inside our home, intimate and invasive, and my hands shook as I opened it because the header read not notice but second warning in black ink this time. The letters heavy and absolute, and below it, not a list of petty rules but a single sentence that looked like an accusation. You were seen. The rest of the page bore a time and a shorthand code I didn't understand, and beneath that 3 simple words that crushed the joke out of the whole thing. Attendance will be noted. I read it twice, thrice, as if repeating the lines would make them less true, and then I woke my wife and showed her, and she read it, her mouth going thin, and we both tried to laugh, because what else do people do in front of their sleeping children when they are scared? But the sound came out like a hiccup, a swallowed animal, and the kids opened their doors sleepily, rubbing their eyes, asking what was wrong, and we told them everything was fine, even as we watched the way our daughter's lower lip trembled as if she tasted salt, as if she already knew the way the world had changed and had no name for the change. That night the house didn't feel like ours. It felt like a stage we had been set upon without our consent, and footsteps that should have been outside felt closer, like a distant partner moving in rhythm around our furniture. And my wife whispered that she kept hearing them circle the house, a soft padded tread that stuttered along the siding and then stopped abruptly, as if someone were counting the windows or mapping the seams of our life. We wanted to call the police, of course, assuredly we did, but when I looked up the number and dialed, my hands went cold because what would I say? Hello, we moved here and now someone is leaving threatening letters? The dispatcher might ask for details, for names, for proof, and I had nothing but paper and the smell of iron on my palms. Besides, every neighbor we'd seen in daylight had been suspiciously evasive. Even the man who kept his hedges so exact his place looked like a museum would meet my eyes and turn away like he had been trained not to speak. And when I pressed talkative, nervous to one of them about the letters, he closed his door and barred it as if he had been shamed into privacy. So we did what we could with the small tools at hand, bolted the doors, checked the windows, drew the curtains with extra care, and sat in the dark, listening as the house sighed and the world beyond the glass seemed to lean in. There is something about enforced silence that sharpens every sound. The tick of a clock becomes a drum. A refrigerator hum becomes a constant voice. Wind against the eaves is transformed into a chorus of low, reproving whispers. At 3 a.m, lying awake and counting the familiar noises in an attempt to anchor myself, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were purposeful, marching a slow ring around the house, stopping at each corner and then continuing, as if someone were physically mapping the perimeter. And when my wife peered through a slender slit in the curtains, she saw nothing but the long, empty street under the moonlight, not a soul, not even a stray cat, only shadows that moved with the soft sigh of the night. But the sound was clear enough in our bones. Someone had walked every inch. The next morning, the second letter's presence had been noted by something else. Our back gate showed prints in the soft mud beside it, prints too small to be an adult's but too neat to be random, like the pattern of someone avoiding certain squares. And the kids sat at the kitchen table with their cereal untouched because horror enters the young differently. It sits, a cold stone, and they stare at it until it becomes a part of them. We tried to reason with each other. Maybe a neighbor was playing a joke. Maybe someone was trying to get us to leave so they could buy the house cheap. Maybe there was a power-mad kid with a printer and too much free time in his hands. But the presence of those footprints, the precise timestamp on the letter, the fact that the stamp matched the others, it felt orchestrated. That afternoon, emboldened and scared in equal measure, I walked the neighborhood with the letter folded in my pocket like contraband. I wanted to ask questions without the fever of the night coloring the eyes of the people I met. But the daylight changed nothing. Faces were neutral, sometimes polite in the mechanical way of people who believed in rules more than neighbors, and the tiny cameras I'd noticed earlier glinted like beetle eyes in the sun, always angled toward the house fronts, as if each home had a camera not to watch the street, but to peer in between the slats of blinds and record the silhouettes of those living inside. When I confronted one man in his driveway, tall, with a trimmed beard and a cardigan that suggested careful taste, he paused, listened to the name of the letter, and then said almost kindly, "You should follow the rules. It's for all of us." And I asked him for specifics, for someone to explain why a community that promises safety would behave like a tribunal, and his answer was simple and absurd. Safety requires sacrifice. And he smiled as though reciting a proverb. And then he closed his garage and the door rolled down like a curtain. The more I pushed, the more I felt the neighborhood close ranks. And that evening another envelope arrived. This one heavier, the paper thick and almost damp with something I couldn't place. And it bore the neat stamp of the HOA, but inside was not an admonition this time but a schedule. A list of lights to be on and off for specific houses at specific times, a map of acceptable sound levels by street, and, tucked under the last row like an afterthought, the names of homes that had been flagged for re-evaluation, with a little symbol beside each name that made me feel like prey on a ledger. When I asked my wife if the symbol meant anything, she simply shook her head and squeezed my hand until my fingers ached. And that night we decided we would ignore one small rule just to prove it couldn't control us. We left a small lamp on until 11:30, a quiet rebellion, a flicker of human thumb against the glass of control, because we deserved a moment of ordinary comfort. And perhaps, too, we wanted to see if the system would respond. The response came in the form of a sound that I will never forget. The footsteps returned, but this time they were not polite or tentative. They were deliberate, activated by our small defiance, and they circled the house 3 times, each pass slower and heavier, the tread audible through the walls, a rhythm. The first thing we noticed was the silence, not the everyday hush that blanketed the neighborhood like a heavy quilt, but a deeper, unnatural kind of silence that came from across the street, from the Miller's house, the one with the blue shutters and the rose bushes that my wife had admired when we first moved in. The house where just 2 nights ago I had seen the faint flicker of a television glowing through a gap in their curtains. A small comfort that told me at least one family here still lived like people and not shadows. But on this morning the curtains were gone, the roses were wilting, and the driveway was empty, not just of cars but of life, as if the place had been vacuumed out overnight, leaving only a shell. And when I asked my wife if she had noticed them leaving, she frowned and shook her head, and we realized neither of us had heard a moving truck, seen any boxes, or even caught a glimpse of the Millers in the last 24 hours. And that absence clung to the street like a rumor no one wanted to speak, because when I tried to ask the neighbor to my left, a short man named Harris who always trimmed his hedges with military precision, he refused to look me in the eye, staring instead at his clippers as if the rhythm of snipping branches was more important than acknowledging that the family across from us had vanished. And when I pressed him, voice sharp with nerves, all he muttered was, "It's better if you don't ask," before retreating into his garage and slamming the door like a judge's gavel ending an argument. And I stood there, stupid and restless, staring at the Miller's house until my daughter tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Where did they go?" And I didn't know how to answer because deep down I already suspected the truth, that they hadn't left by choice. They had been taken, not in the way a burglar or kidnapper takes, but in the way the HOA seemed to claim what it decided no longer belonged. That night the street felt emptier, the darkness heavier, as though one house gone hollow shifted the weight of the entire block. And when I finally broke down and asked an older woman walking her dog if she knew what happened, she gave me a look that was both pity and warning, and she whispered, "Final warning letter." And then she tugged her dog so sharply it yelped and hurried away. leaving those words like a cold coin in my hand, and I couldn't stop turning them over in my mind. Final warning letter, until the syllables didn't sound real anymore, and yet I knew they were, because the Millers had simply evaporated, and no one was willing to say more, and that silence was worse than any explanation. I told myself I would prove it, that I would walk up to the Millers' house, knock on the door, maybe even peek through the windows, just to show myself it was empty, nothing more. But when I stepped onto their lawn, the air changed, colder, sharper, like static rising from the ground, and every instinct in me screamed that I wasn't supposed to be there, that I was trespassing not just on property but on some unwritten law. And when I touched the doorknob, I found it unlocked. And inside the house was worse than I imagined. It wasn't abandoned, it was erased. Furniture still in place, but covered in a thick film of dust that shouldn't have been there after only one day. Family photos hanging on the wall, but the faces blurred. Not in the way of bad photography, but as though the ink had melted, smeared into obscurity, and the air smelled faintly of something burned, though nothing looked scorched. And as I stood there, my heart pounding, I swore I heard a voice, faint and cracked, whispering from upstairs. A single word repeated again and again, gone, 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 until I ran out, slamming the door behind me. And when I turned back toward the street, I saw 3 neighbors watching me from their windows, blinds slightly parted, their eyes unblinking. And when they saw me notice, the blinds snapped shut in unison like the click of a lock. And I realized then that the Millers hadn't just vanished. They had been erased. Every trace of them scrubbed from the block, and no one would ever speak of them again except in whispers. Because the HOA didn't evict you, it consumed you, and if we weren't careful, we would be next. That night I couldn't sleep, every creak of the house sounding louder, every gust of wind brushing against the siding like fingers dragging along wood. And in the dark, my wife whispered that she couldn't stop thinking about the Millers either, about how one day they were there and the next they were nothing, and she asked me if I thought we could just leave before it was too late, pack up quietly and vanish ourselves before whatever happened to them happened to us. But the thought of leaving felt heavier than staying, because something about this neighborhood was like a trap, not just of fences and rules, but of something older, something that clung to the bones of the houses themselves. And I told her that if the Millers couldn't leave, what made her think we could? And those words made her turn away from me, curling into herself like a child. And for the rest of the night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to faint footsteps outside circling the street. The same sound we had heard after the second warning, except now it was louder. Closer, like whoever or whatever walked out there wanted me to hear it, wanted me to know that we were being watched. And at one point I thought I saw a shadow pause outside our window, tall and still, and though I waited for it to move, it didn't until the first light of dawn crept across the sky, and then it was gone, dissolved into the brightness like smoke. The next morning I tried again to speak to Harris to corner him while he collected his mail, but the moment I said the Miller's name, his jaw tightened, and he shoved past me without a word, his hand trembling so badly that half his envelope slipped from his grip and scattered across the driveway. But he didn't stop to pick them up. He just kept walking, and it was only later, when I bent down to gather them, that I saw one envelope different from the others, thicker, sealed with the same red stamp as the warnings we had received, and though my chest tightened with dread, I slid it into my pocket and hurried inside, locking the door before opening it. And what I found made my stomach twist. A letter marked with final warning in bold red letters, but the name on the top wasn't mine, it was the Millers, and the message beneath was nothing but a single line, cold and absolute, "This property has been reclaimed." My wife's hands shook when I showed her, and she begged me to burn it, to throw it away before anyone knew I had it. But something in me resisted, some stubborn need to understand, so I hid it beneath the loose floorboard in our bedroom instead. Though even as I did, I swore I heard a faint scratching sound under the wood, as if something trapped below was reaching up to claim it. That evening when I went out to take the trash, I noticed the Miller's house again, and this time it looked worse. The shutters cracked, the paint peeling, the windows dark with grime, all in less than 48 hours, as though the house itself was decaying without the family inside, or maybe because of what had happened to them. And when I turned back, I saw Harris watching me from across the street, his face pale, lips pressed thin, and though he didn't speak, the way his eyes darted toward the Miller's house and then back to me was warning enough. Don't go there again. That night, however, I couldn't help myself, and I dreamed of the Millers, dreamed of them sitting in their living room, faces blurred and voices garbled like static, waving at me through the window, not with friendliness but with desperation, as though they wanted me to join them. To step inside, and when I woke, sweating and shaking, I thought for a moment I could still hear them, faint cries echoing from across the street, muffled but insistent. And I realized the worst thing of all wasn't that the HOA erased people. It was that the people never really left. They lingered in the walls, in the dark, in the spaces between footsteps. And once you received that final warning, you didn't disappear. You became part of whatever this neighborhood really was, trapped forever in silence. It was the sort of small, stupid thing that feels harmless until it isn't. The bins were supposed to be pulled in by dusk, a mundane rule among dozens that we tried to follow like a checklist to keep our new life from unraveling. But that week had been one of boxes and appointments and the kind of exhaustion that makes the little things slip through your hands. And so when I went out to fetch the newspaper one night, the bins still sat on the curb, lids ajar and a wayward bag nudging the edge. And I remember thinking, annoyed at myself, that tomorrow I'd apologize to the HOA or to whatever neighbor had noticed and make them understand. But in a place where silence is law, apology means nothing if the offense has been seen, and sometime in the dark after midnight, when the house breathed and the kids finally slept, something quieter than a door but louder in its consequence was slipped under our mat. A black envelope, heavy and matte like a shadow folded into paper, and when I tore it open under the kitchen light, the words stamped on the page hit like a stone. Third warning. 3 blunt letters arranged like a verdict, and below them a list of infractions, the exact time our bins had sat idle, the angle at which our porch light had still been on, and then a line that made my throat close. Surveillance initiated. And below that a precise notation, visuals recorded and archived, and a code that looked like an address for something I did not understand. And it was the first time I felt truly naked in my own home, not because someone had seen me, but because someone had recorded me, fixed me into a file like an animal in a document, to be reviewed and judged by an authority with no face. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It unfurled like cold water spreading from your feet. First there was disbelief, then anger, then a hot, animal fear that tightened every muscle. And I remember the stupid little rituals I did to convince myself I could still control something. I checked the locks twice. I walked to every curtain and shook them closed. I unplugged the bedside lamp and counted the seconds until the house felt, again, like an inhabited place rather than a theater, set for an invisible audience, but the envelope's message had already broken something inside me. Our privacy had been invaded, and the manner of invasion felt personal, almost intimate, as if they had not only watched the exterior of our lives but had crept in to set up a camera that could see into the rooms where we thought we were truly alone. The next morning, where the first light slanted weakly through the blinds, there was a small, almost surgical notch in the soffit under the eaves, a barely perceptible hole like a pinprick, and when I climbed a stepladder to peer into it, something flashed. Tiny glass, reflective a lens no larger than a bead, angled down toward the bedroom window, and my stomach dropped because it was not alone. There were other lenses tucked in plain sight under porch lights in gutter corners, in the space where the siding met the foundation, and a cold, terrible comprehension settled in that whatever watched us had been placed with care, not vandalism but installation, deliberate and permanent, and the thought that somebody, had been recording the hollow private moments of our family sickened me more than any physical threat. I told my wife, hands shaking, and her face lost color the way a photograph fades, and the kids hovered at the doorway like frightened animals, asking questions with the bluntness of children who haven't yet been taught fear. And we decided to photograph every camera, to document the invasion, to have proof for the police, for whoever might need it. But when I stepped back out to record the devices on my phone, I noticed something else. Small adhesive pads stuck under our porch railing. Tiny RFID tags, perhaps. And when I tried to pry one loose, it snapped cleanly, and left behind nothing but a ghost of glue, and the unshakable sense that whatever technology this was, it was meant to be invisible in the long term, meant to be forgotten until some algorithm or human eye decided to pull the thread. We called the police, of course, my hands fumbling as I explained the cameras and the warning and the black envelope, and the dispatcher's voice was professional, flat, the kind that comes when 1,000 calls have dulled reaction, and when officers did arrive they were polite but distant, nodding at our photos, cataloging the locations of the lenses, promising to run checks and file a report. but they left with the same blankness that the neighbors wore, and we had the feeling, not stated, not even implied, that this was not a criminal matter in the usual sense. It was something that sat outside the neat boxes of law, and the station gave us a card that felt like a Band-Aid on an open wound. After the officers left, silence returned, but it had been altered. It now bristled with the knowledge that watchers had edges and those edges had teeth. That night the house felt smaller, compressed by the knowledge of cameras everywhere. And sleep was a promise I couldn't keep because paranoia is a soundless monster that devours rest. I found myself imagining the angles those lenses captured. Our kitchen table where we did homework, the couch where we whispered secrets, the bedroom where my wife and I had once believed we could hide in each other's arms, and I imagined someone swiping through clips of our ordinary life like a bored director, pausing at a laugh, rewinding a sigh, cataloging habits into files, and the intimacy of it made me furious in a way that made my knuckles white. In those first days after the third warning, the cameras multiplied, a slow infestation, like mold in the corners of the walls. New lenses appeared at the back gate, in the birdhouse on the fence post, even inside the hollow of a porch column where a child could hide and think no one would ever see. And there was the added horror of finding one morning a tiny, almost indistinguishable peephole set into the trim above our son's bedroom door, at a height that meant whoever watched did not want to see toys or overhear childish nonsense. They wanted to see how he slept, to know if fear woke him, to monitor how the family responded to its own terror. We attempted to remove them, to smash lenses and rip wires and peel hidden pads, and each time we did, a lens would be gone for a day and then reappear in a new place, or a replacement would be installed overnight anywhere we could not guard. Inside the attic, behind a smoke detector, inside a light fixture, and once, in a moment that stripped me of any remaining illusions about who we were dealing with, I found a tiny camera tucked inside an unplugged baby monitor that my wife had kept, covered in dust as if it had been there from the house's first days, and it felt like a betrayal so intimate I wanted to vomit. We thought about suing the HOA, about hiring a lawyer, about posting on social media, about public shaming, but each plan felt like a match striking in a hurricane, pointless, bound to be snuffed, because the neighborhood's walls were thicker than any single opinion. And when we considered the possibility of leaving, we were held back by a new terror. We didn't know if leaving meant escape or erasure, and the Miller's house sat in my mind like a warning etched into the road. As paranoia grew, so did a brittle bravado in me. I wanted to fight back with light and truth, to hang a sign in our front yard that declared we knew, that we would not be observed like animals for sport. But every move I considered came with the knowledge that the watchers had hours of footage, that they knew when we slept and when we were most vulnerable, and I imagined them watching my defiance like a game, waiting to record how I failed. One night, driven more by spite than sense, I set up my own camera in the living room, an old camcorder repurposed to catch anything that might be filmed from the other side, and I left it running all night, a small rebellion, and when I reviewed the footage the next morning, my blood ran cold. The footage captured, in the grainy glow of infrared, the slow rotation of our own lamps as if some unseen hand had brushed them, the curtains twitching though no breeze moved, and for a heartbeat, reflected in the television blackness, a silhouette moved across the hallway, tall, thin, not quite human, the kind of figure you read about in fevered dreams, only to vanish when the light flicked. And more than that, the night view showed tiny pinpricks of light, like distant stars appearing in the corners of rooms, and when I enhanced the footage I could see the lenses, dozens of them, sending back red dots like a field of watchful eyes, and my stomach fell because if they could be seen on my camera, they had been recording everything we did from the moment we'd set foot in the house. And the files in the black envelopes were not just infractions. They were a dossier of intimacy, a map of our private hours they could use however they pleased. The third warning had stopped being a notice and had become a promise. The watchers were always active now, and we lived each second under their invisible illumination, while the envelopes kept coming like taps on a coffin, and the finality of their tone, surveillance initiated, visuals archived, left no room for comfort, only the slow building of a terror that would shape the next choices we made. The envelope was waiting for us before dawn, though I don't remember hearing footsteps or a knock, only the sound of silence pressing against the house like a storm held back by glass. And when I opened the door, the black shape lay centered on the mat like a predator crouching. Heavier than the others, the paper thicker, its edges sharp enough to slice, and my stomach tightened before I even bent to pick it up, because I knew, in a way that bypassed reason, that this one wasn't like the rest. This was the end of the line, the culmination of every whispered rule and red-letter warning. And when I tore the seal open in the dim morning light, my hands shaking, the words on the page weren't written in the precise mechanical ink we had seen before, but in something darker, wet-looking, as if it had been dragged across the page with a trembling brush. And the message was brutally simple. You have been chosen. Tonight. There was no list of rules, no timestamps or recorded offenses, no bureaucratic coldness to soften it. Just those 5 words, heavy and absolute, a death sentence disguised as a notice. My wife's voice cracked when she read it over my shoulder, her breath hitching in a way that told me she wanted to scream but didn't dare, because somehow we both knew the walls would carry the sound to ears we couldn't see. I folded the paper slowly, deliberately, like it might explode if I moved too fast, and I told the kids to stay upstairs, told them it was just another letter, another misunderstanding, but their eyes were wide, old with fear in a way children shouldn't be, and I realized they already knew the truth, had known for weeks, maybe since the first letter, because kids hear what adults try to hide, and they had heard the whispers, the footsteps, the silence gathering like dust in the corners of the house. That day stretched on forever, each hour a drumbeat toward night, and everything in the neighborhood seemed altered. The air was stiller, too clean, as if even the birds had been ordered to be quiet. The sky was pale and empty of clouds, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with something terrible, and the neighbors moved like shadows, heads down, eyes refusing to linger, as though they had already accepted that tonight was ours, that the covenant demanded blood not from them but from us, and they were relieved to be spared another cycle. By evening the strangeness deepened. The power flickered once, twice, then steadied, but the lights carried a faint hum like bees trapped in glass, and when I walked to the window to peek outside, the street was deserted. No cars, no joggers, no children on bikes, just an expanse of asphalt that felt less like a road and more like a stage, empty and waiting for actors to appear. And I knew with a kind of hollow certainty that this was all orchestrated, rehearsed long before we arrived, and tonight the final act would play. My wife wanted to leave, begged me to pack the kids into the car and drive until the gas ran out. But the moment we stepped onto the porch, a coldness wrapped around us, a stillness that felt like the air had thickened into glass. And when I reached for the car keys in my pocket, the streetlights buzzed and flickered, and in that stuttering light I saw them, shadows long and unnatural, stretching from the corners of the street toward our house, moving though no figures cast them, sliding forward inch by inch with each pulse of the lamps. And my heart thundered as I realized that leaving wasn't an option. Escape wasn't possible, because the covenant didn't need locks or fences. It needed belief, and we had already given it ours with every fearful glance, every letter we had opened, every rule we had obeyed. So we retreated inside, slamming the door, locking bolts that suddenly felt like toys against something so much older. And as darkness swallowed the neighborhood, the house itself seemed to change, the walls groaning softly as though something inside them shifted, settling into place for the ritual to come, and the air grew thick with the scent of iron and ash, and my skin prickled with the awareness that we weren't alone. Not anymore, that the watchers who had hidden behind cameras and notices were here now, gathering, visible in the twitch of shadows at the edge of lamplight, in the flicker of movement just beyond the curtain, and my hands shook as I held my family close, the envelope heavy in my pocket like a stone carved with our fate. As the last light bled from the sky, the house seemed to shrink inward, pressing its walls close around us like a cage, and every room carried a weight it hadn't carried before, as if the air itself had thickened, and I kept moving from window to window, pulling the curtains tighter, though I knew it wouldn't matter, because when shadows want to come in, fabric can't keep them out. But doing something, anything, was better than standing still. And in the silence between my movements, I realized I could hear a faint sound beneath the hum of the lamps and the breath of the refrigerator, a low rhythmic murmur like chanting carried from far away, and when I pressed my ear to the wall it grew clearer, a chorus of voices repeating words in a language I didn't recognize, guttural and deep, layered so thickly it felt like the house itself was speaking. And when my wife asked me what I was listening to, I lied and said it was nothing, because telling her the truth would have broken something in her, and we were already fragile. The kids huddled on the couch, eyes darting toward every corner, and my daughter whispered that she saw someone standing in the hallway. But when I turned, there was nothing. only the dark stretch of carpet. Though for the briefest second I thought I saw an indentation on the rug, the weight of invisible feet pressing into the fibers, and I nearly screamed at them to go upstairs to hide, but where could they hide? There was no corner of this house left untouched, no space not seen, no refuge not claimed by the covenant that had chosen us. The lights flickered again, plunging us into darkness for a breathless heartbeat, and in that moment of absence I saw them clearly through the front window. The shadows no longer stretched but upright, standing in the middle of the street like a congregation, dozens of them, tall and thin, some with edges that bent like broken glass, some with limbs too long, some with faces that blurred in and out like bad reception, and though they made no sound I could feel them watching, waiting, patient as predators who know the cage is already locked. When the light stuttered back on the street was empty, but the echo of them lingered in my bones and I knew they hadn't left. They had simply moved closer. My wife gripped my arm so hard her nails cut into my skin, her voice a hoarse whisper begging me to do something. But what could I do? Call the police again? Run into the night? Every option was a doorway that led straight back into the jaws of whatever had written those words in the envelope. I decided, stupidly, to confront it, to speak aloud, to address the air itself like a madman, and I shouted, voice cracking, "What do you want from us?" The house answered with silence at first, so deep it made my ears ache. And then the lights flickered again, not in random bursts but in a rhythm, on off like a heartbeat. And in that pulse the chanting grew louder, spilling into the rooms, vibrating through the floorboards, and for the first time I understood. This wasn't about rules or order or fines, this was about offering, about payment. About blood feeding something that lived not in the bylaws but in the bones of the neighborhood itself. The envelope hadn't said we were warned. It had said we were chosen, and chosen meant sacrifice. My son began to cry then, small sobs muffled against his sleeve, and I knew the sound had betrayed us, because the house groaned, the windows rattled, and in the glass I saw shapes pressing closer, their faces smeared against the pane as though the barrier between inside and out was thinning, and the panic in me reached its breaking point. I grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, clutching it like a sword, though I knew it was laughable against what waited outside, but in that moment rage was the only thing holding back despair, and I swore that if they came through the door I would at least meet them standing. But they didn't use the door. The lights died completely then, plunging us into blackness so total it felt like drowning. And in that blackness came the first whisper, not from outside but from inside the room right behind my ear, a voice that rasped my name in a tone that was both intimate and mocking. And when I spun around, swinging the poker wildly, there was nothing. But my wife screamed from across the room that something had touched her hair, and then the kids cried out together as the couch shuddered beneath them like an animal bucking, and the chanting rose to a roar, filling every crevice, every pore, until the whole house shook with it and I knew the ritual had begun.